most satisfying part is twofold. I believe as both a practitioner in the field in healthcare, as a psychotherapist specializing in complex trauma, so I often see people at the other end or in the middle of their lived experience with disempowering social determinants of health. I find it empowering and hopeful for me to kind of really muddy my hands up and dig into the clay of what is the hope and progress in the field of public health and healthcare. So that is a hugely satisfying part of it for me. And it's an honor, I think, to look at the fresh material and see where the direction and the future of healthcare is moving. It reinvigorates my work as a practitioner, and it makes me feel a part of something promising when I feel like many of us, especially after a certain election season, we feel pretty tired, worn out, and it's it's always reassuring and gives camaraderie that there's other people out there in the trenches with us.
Are there any challenges for you in this?
Surely, yeah, I appreciate you saying that. I think one of the challenges, but I will often work through because I can find linkages or be inspired to brush up on my own areas, plural of expertise, is that the fields of healthcare and public health are ever changing.
Hmm.
There's new language all the time. So when I'm reviewing a paper, I want to be mindful, of course, that it is in my scope of expertise and to be transparent about where my scope begins and ends, both if an editor approaches me or as a reviewer in the review documentation. I think also the challenge for me is probably quite obvious. I tend to be much more on the gentler, supportive side. So getting sharp and direct with critical feedback is an area that I've had to grow in and challenge myself, but I like that kind of challenge. I think it's important to give robust,
Yeah.
well-rounded feedback.
Do you have any advice for folks who are on the gentler end when it
Mm,
comes to that?
wonderful follow-up question. I think my advice would be to think like a writer, consider if you were on the other side, how many times do we spend weeks, months, years working on a document, and if somebody says, "Oh, it's just fine, I loved this part here," we can think about what it's like to be on the other side, that we really are hungry for a little bit of polishing, taking the manuscript to the next
Yeah. I
level.
was just wondering when you get an article, how do you evaluate the significance of a paper, in terms of its topic or methods? What are the things you're looking for?
Great, well said. Well, I think both in the past work with HPHR and now BCPH, there's a lovely rubric to follow in what we're looking for quality. So that's the first thing that I will tend to and keep in the back of my mind. And I'll keep a checklist either in a Word document or a scrap piece of paper as I go through a manuscript. Big picture, I think in terms of both and in equal parts, the content and then also the manuscript presentation or the structure and flow. That does both, it comes up in the rubric anyhow, I'm reviewing something. Content, I think of in terms of, is this just rehashing? Does it go beyond just a literature review? So is the content really shifting and expanding and underscoring or zooming in on something really important in public health or healthcare? Those are the questions and thoughts going through my mind. And does it feel kind of holistic? Holistic, I mean, in terms of does it honor some of the history and the associative approaches? I'll kind of talk about that a little bit uh, in follow up a little bit later, perhaps. Um, or is it just trying to use like the latest content and terms and jargon and using it that way? I often like to look for a little bit of content that gives homage and references past work to bring the field of public health and healthcare to where it's at right
I was
now.
wondering if you could share a time when your feedback elevated a manuscript, and you could just sort of walk us through that
I really
experience.
enjoyed working with an author that clearly I think didn't have all the traditional privileges of um, going to best schools. I think they were a community college writer and submitter. Um, Maybe being someone with a very lived experience with marginalized social determinants and really empowering them. They were so close to resubmitting, but I think a bit intimidated by the resubmission process. But I really felt fulfilled in giving them specifics of what they could do to grow their writing career, to grow their voice as a public health author and academic, and letting them know that their voice matters. So maybe we didn't see it panning out that time, but hopefully they'll come back and resubmit
I
down
think
the
you
road.
you say like a really beautiful thing, and I think that's one of the benefits of working with a journal like ours and having reviewers like yourself be part of it is that even if your paper is ultimately rejected,
Hmm.
we want the experience to be one where folks still learn from it. You know, we've started to ask folks to include authors, I should say, to include a positionality statement,
Hmm.
just to let us know like where they're coming from, because you know we are a journal of social equity and social justice and equity. And I was just wondering, how do you consider the positionality of an author, or do you when you're reviewing a piece?
It's a wonderful question, and it's near and dear to my heart because in my work, I think maybe I have an advantage or added challenge because it's always on my mind.
Mm-hmm.
Positionality matters. I'm trained as a psychotherapist. When I sit with someone, I may have threads of interconnection, and yet even within interconnection, it's a disservice if we assume that one's lived experience is akin to another. So I take it into account. I take into account positionality, which I consider to be someone's lived experience and point of view based on lived experience and education, to inform maybe the way that the content and the writing manifests. Um, and then I also understand what it's like for me to be that reader on the paper and to keep that in mind, both as audience member and in terms of language. I think language is a important cultural manifestation. So sometimes I'll try to honor, quiet the volume on judgments in style of presentation because I know there's a difference. And then it's one of those things like I spoke of earlier, where if I read a really important paper recently on DEI and DEIJ, I think specifically in healthcare, and I recurrently was thinking in terms of where this person's lived experience and specific area of academic training was coming from, and then thinking of how my own expertise in social inclusion and lived experience um, compares and contrasts. So I tried to just offer some expansive ideas, but also meet them with where they were at, and it was a really cool tango.